The truck backed up to the county fairgrounds pen on a Tuesday morning with 90 goats nobody had bid on, animals pulled from a dispersal sale after a dairy operation 2 counties overfolded for good. Underweight, mixed ages, several visibly favoring bad legs, the kind of lot that auctioneers usually moved fast at rock-bottom prices just to clear the pen. This time nobody moved at all. The buyers who mattered had already filled their trailers with the sound Young does earlier that morning, and what remained was the leftover, the culls. Animals, with problems nobody wanted to inherit. Into that empty silence walked a man in his 50s, feeling his way along the pen rail with a white cane in one hand, his other hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a young woman who served as his part-time aide. He'd been blind for 11 years. The result of a degenerative condition that had taken his sight slowly enough that he'd had time to grieve it properly before it finished the job entirely. He stood at that rail a long time, head tilted, listening to 90 goats he couldn't see, and then he raised his hand and bid on the entire lot. The auctioneer actually paused the sale to make sure he'd heard correctly. A rancher standing nearby, a heavy-set man named Boyd Pruitt, who ran the county's largest commercial herd, laughed loud enough to carry across the whole yard and said the blind man had just bought himself 90 headaches he'd never even be able to see coming, and that half of them would be dead by spring from problems he wouldn't catch until it was too late. He meant it as a joke at another man's expense. It would turn out to be the last joke anyone made about him. If you believe the senses everyone assumes matter least are sometimes the ones that matter most, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. His name was Walter Chen, and he'd spent the first 30 years of his working life as a machinist before his vision started failing in his early 40s. A slow theft that took color first, then peripheral vision, then, over the better part of a decade, nearly everything else. He'd moved out to 8 acres on the edge of the county after his wife passed, inheriting the small property from an uncle who'd kept a handful of dairy oats there as a hobby. Decades earlier, the old milking shed still standing, though nothing had lived in it for 15 years. Walter had spent his first 2 years of blindness relearning almost everything, the particular grief of a man who'd once built precision engine parts by sight, now having to trust his hands, his ears, and a white cane to navigate a world that had stopped waiting for him to catch up. He'd gone through the predictable stages people expect of that kind of loss, though he'd have told you privately that none of the stages other people described quite matched what it actually felt like, less a single grief than a long series of smaller ones, each new limitation announcing itself at its own pace. He'd lost his job at the machine shop within a year of his diagnosis. Not out of cruelty, but out of practical necessity. Neither he nor his employer knew how to work around at the time. And he'd spent the following months in a kind of suspended anger he wasn't proud of, directed at nothing in particular, because there was no one person to blame for a degenerative condition that had simply decided, for reasons no doctor could fully explain, to take his sight on its own schedule. What brought him to goats specifically wasn't sentiment. It was something closer to necessity mixed with a stubborn refusal to let blindness mean the end of doing real physical work. A hobby farmer down the road had mentioned, almost in passing, that a properly run small livestock operation could be managed largely by sound and touch if a person was patient enough to learn it, and something about that idea had lodged itself in Walter's mind and refused to leave. There was one person in the county who might actually understand what Walter was trying to do, and that was a retired large animal veterinarian named Dr. Louise Ferris, 70 years old, who'd spent 4 decades treating livestock across 3 counties before handing her practice to a younger partner. She had a reputation for taking on cases nobody else wanted to bother with, and Corinne, the extension office secretary, made the introduction after Walter came in, asking blunt questions nobody else had patience for. Louise drove out to Walter's place before he'd bought a single goat, and she didn't sugarcoat the scale of what he was proposing. She told him plainly that sighted farmers missed early signs of illness in their herds constantly, and that he'd be attempting something with a genuine handicap in a field where most people already struggled. But she also told him something that stuck with him for the rest of that conversation and every day afterward. A goat's body tells you almost everything through sound and touch if you know what you're listening and feeling for, she said. Sighted farmers get lazy relying on a glance. You won't have that option, which might actually work in your favor once you've learned what to listen for. That was the beginning of something neither of them fully expected. Louise became something between a teacher and a skeptic in residence over the following months, refusing to make anything easy on him, insisting he learn to identify a goat's condition, through means most farmers never bothered developing because sight made it unnecessary. She taught him to recognize a healthy goat's breathing rhythm against an early respiratory infection's subtle rasp, to feel body condition through his palms with enough precision to catch weight loss, weeks before it became visually obvious to a sighted observer, to identify lameness through the specific rhythm of hooves on packed earth rather than watching a limp develop. Most people think caring for livestock is primarily a visual skill. Louise told him one afternoon, guiding his hands over a goat's rib cage to demonstrate proper body condition scoring by feel alone. It's really about pattern recognition, and sound and touch carry more reliable patterns than most sighted farmers ever bother learning, because they've never had to. Walter's first real test came within his first month of ownership, when he noticed a change in the herd's collective sound during evening feeding that he couldn't immediately place. A subtle difference in the rhythm of chewing and movement that unsettled him without giving him a clear reason why. He called Louise, who walked him through a series of questions over the phone before concluding, based entirely on his description, that something in the feed itself was likely off, possibly early mold contamination in a shipment he'd received that week. He located the affected bag by smell alone, an ability he'd developed without fully realizing it, and pulled it before any goats had eaten enough to cause serious harm. Louise was impressed enough by that catch to tell him plainly it was better than most sighted farmers would have managed, most of whom wouldn't have noticed anything wrong until animals actually started showing symptoms. But not every early lesson went smoothly. Walter's first attempt at identifying a limping goat within the larger herd nearly cost him valuable treatment time when he misjudged which animal was actually affected, following a sound pattern that turned out to belong to a goat, with a minor stone in its hoof rather than the doe actually developing a more serious infection nearby. Louise didn't sugarcoat the mistake when he called her, frustrated. "You're still learning to separate individual animals within a group sound," she told him. "That takes longer than learning to recognize one goat alone. Don't rush past that step." Walter rebuilt his approach around patience after that, spending weeks simply sitting near the herd during feeding and rest periods, training his ear to distinguish individual animals within the larger group sound the way a parent learns to pick a single child's voice out of a crowded room. It was slow, unglamorous work, made harder by the fact that he was essentially building a skill set from scratch that almost no other farmer in the county had ever needed to develop. Word moved through the county the way it always did, most of it unkind at first. Boyd Pruitt made a habit of bringing up the blind man's goats at the feed store whenever conversation lagged, treating it as an ongoing joke that never quite got old to the men who laughed along with him. A few people quietly wondered aloud whether someone should intervene, as though Walter's blindness alone disqualified him from making his own decisions about his own animals and his own life. But not everyone dismissed it. Corinne at the extension office started stopping by more than her job required, curious rather than concerned. And Louise, despite grumbling regularly about how much of her retirement Walter's questions were consuming, kept showing up unprompted more often than the arrangement technically required. The turning point came during a respiratory illness outbreak that swept through several commercial herds in the county. That winter, the kind of fast-moving pneumonia that could devastate a herd if not caught in its earliest, quietest stages. Boyd Pruitt's own operation, run by sighted, experienced hands who nonetheless relied heavily on visual inspection during quick daily walkthroughs, lost 11 animals before the outbreak was fully identified and contained. Walter, who spent considerably more time listening to his herd than any sighted farmer typically spent looking at theirs. Caught the first subtle change in breathing patterns among 3 goats nearly a week before any visible symptoms would have appeared, isolating them immediately and calling Louise before the infection had a chance to spread through the rest of his herd. He lost none. That got attention in a way nothing else could have. By that spring, word of what Walter had actually built had spread well beyond the county, and Louise had begun documenting his methods with an eye toward something bigger than either of them had originally intended. What Walter was actually doing, she came to realize, wasn't simply compensating for his blindness. He'd developed a genuinely more attentive, more granular method of herd health monitoring than most sighted operations bothered with, precisely because he'd never had the option of relying on a quick visual glance to reassure himself everything was fine. But the herd wasn't finished testing him. In early summer, Walter noticed something wrong in the sound of one particular doe he'd been especially attached to, one of the original 90 he'd rebuilt from nearly nothing. Her chewing rhythm had grown irregular, and when he ran his hands carefully over her jaw, he found swelling that worried him enough to call Louise immediately. She examined the goat and told him it looked like early signs of a dental abscess, treatable if caught early, but potentially serious if ignored. "This is the part nobody tells you about working with animals this closely," Louise said, packing up her kit afterward. "It's not really about the big dramatic catches. It's about noticing the small wrong thing early enough that it never becomes a big one." Walter treated the abscess immediately under Louise's guidance, and the doe recovered fully within weeks. It was a small crisis in the scope of everything he'd already built, but it reinforced something that had become the foundation of his entire approach. Caring for a herd wasn't a skill you finished learning. It was something you kept practicing every single day for as long as you kept animals worth caring for. By the following year, Walter's herd had grown to over 120 goats, all descended from animals nobody else had wanted, and his reputation for catching illness earlier than sighted operations had begun drawing genuine professional attention. A veterinary school 2 hours away reached out, asking whether he'd be willing to let students observe his methods, curious whether some of his sound and touch-based health monitoring techniques might be worth teaching more broadly, even to sighted farmers, as a supplement to visual inspection rather than a replacement for it. Boyd Pruitt, for his part, never publicly admitted anything, but his own herd manager was seen more than once parked outside Walter's fence line, watching him work through evening chores with something that looked less like mockery and more like genuine study. And within 2 years, several of the county's commercial operations had quietly adopted at least some version of the closer, more frequent physical and auditory monitoring. Walter had been forced to develop out of necessity, unable to deny that it caught problems their quick visual walkthroughs regularly missed. The county didn't change overnight. But something in the way people looked at Walter did. A blind man with 90 rejected goats stopped being a punchline and became cautiously at first, and then without much hesitation at all, someone people drove out to actually learn from. Boyd Pruitt himself, months after his own herd's outbreak, finally drove out to Walter's place directly, rather than sending his manager to watch from the fence line, and stood there a long while before admitting, in his own gruff way, that he'd been wrong to write the man off as easily as he had. Walter, who held no particular grudge over the joke that had followed him through that first hard winter, simply told him the offer to learn was still open, the same as it had always been for anyone willing to actually listen. What Walter had built wasn't flashy. It wasn't a business empire or a dramatic transformation story with a tidy bow on it. It was a small, patient system built on attention nobody else had bothered to develop, proof that the sense everyone assumed mattered least in farming might, in the right hands, matter more than anyone had given it credit for. He still works that same herd today, moving through his pens with the same unhurried confidence, listening for the sounds that tell him everything he needs to know. His aid still comes by a few mornings a week to help with tasks that genuinely require sight, reading medication labels, or checking fence lines for damage he can't feel from a distance. But the day-to-day work of actually knowing his animals, understanding which one was slightly off before anyone else could have noticed, that work belongs entirely to Walter, built from nothing but patience, ears, and hands that had once made their living building precision machine parts and had found, in the end, an entirely different kind of precision to master. And every season, when new farmers come out to learn what he's built, a few more people remember exactly why they used to laugh, and exactly why they don't anymore. If you've ever had something everyone assumed was a weakness turn out to be exactly what saved you, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about people who turned exactly what the world doubted into something nobody expected.